Welcome, everyone. I am Julie Zuckerman, for those who don't know me, author of the Book of Jeremiah. And welcome to the February Literary Modiin author event. Almost 4.5 months ago, our lives were forever changed on October 7th, and now we're on day 135. Still waiting and praying for all of our 134 hostages to return home, hostages who haven't left our minds for one moment. I'm going to say more about the war at the end of the session, but I did read something interesting today. The Daniel Gordis newsletter, Israel from the Inside, he had an interview with Professor Danny, no, I forget the name now, blah, whatever. And trauma specialist, and he was talking about how we don't all necessarily need therapy, we need to build resilience. And one of the ways of doing that is by storytelling and continuing to have cultural events and all the things that we normally do. So I'm really happy to be turning to something joyful now, which is the release of new Jewish books into the world. Literary Modiin, for those who are new here, started almost 5 years ago now, and this is our 46th event. We started as an in-person event in Modiin, which is where I'm coming to you from, and then with the pandemic, we switched to Zoom. So the format of this event is that each author will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then we open it up to questions. And we have a large audience in attendance, so everyone is on mute, but you can put your questions in the chat box as the authors are speaking or at the end. And if you have any technical difficulties, just send a private note in the chat to me. Okay, so now I will introduce our first author. Michelle Cameron is the author of Jewish historical fiction, with her most recent being Babylon, a novel of Jewish captivity. Previous works include the award-winning Beyond the Ghetto Gates and The Fruit of Her Hands, the story of Shira Ashkenaz. She has also published a verse novel, In the Shadow of the Globe. Napoleon's Mirage, the sequel to Beyond the Ghetto Gates, is forthcoming in November 2024. Michelle, you are very busy. Michelle is the director of the Writers Circle, a New Jersey-based creative writing program serving children, teens, and adults. She lives in Chatham, New Jersey with her husband and has 2 grown sons, of whom she is inordinately proud. And this is Michelle's second time at Literary Modiin. Last year in January, she was here and she was at an in-person event. So let me spotlight you, Michelle, and then you can take it away.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So I'm 1 second. I pull this up so that I can see it. So unfortunately, I can't see you, but this is the easiest way for me to get my notes in front of me. So yes, as Julie said, I was in Modiin last year and really enjoyed being able to be with everyone in person. I really wish I could be there now and that my schedule permitted me to join the Writers' Solidarity mission that Julie is organizing. But I do want everyone to know that I will be there in spirit when that happens. I wrote Babylon more than a decade ago. My agent, having sold The Fruit of Her Hands successfully to Simon & Schuster, took the novel out to potential publishers in 2009, a recession year. Its editor was let go by Simon & Schuster, which meant I lost my advocate in the publishing house. They didn't even bring out a paperback, which definitely would have increased my sales. So when my agent gave up on Babylon, her shrug and statement said it all. You just don't have the numbers. It didn't matter that many of the editors said something like, if times were different, I'd take this novel in a heartbeat. Times weren't different. My agent gave up after submitting the book to so many publishers that it didn't seem worth pursuing further. So I put Babylon on the shelf and moved on. But I never lost faith in the novel. And as I improved as a writer, I'd go back to the manuscript and tweak it a little bit more. Every once in a while, I dip my toe back into the pool of submissions, mainly to smaller independent houses. But it took more than a decade to find the right publisher. In that time, I'd written Beyond the Ghetto Gates, which was published in April 2020, which is the book we discussed last winter. And as Julie said, the sequel, Napoleon's Mirage, will be published in November of 2024. I owe finally finding a publisher to Facebook. A member of a Jewish writers group I belong to, mentioned the Post Hill Press had a new Jewish imprint and were looking for manuscripts. So almost on a whim, I sat down and dashed off a query letter, which seemed to be lost in the void. But I finally received an email apologizing for the months-long delay, saying that they'd be interested in seeing the manuscript if it were still available. I had to laugh. Of course, it was still available. More months passed. Then, one morning, I received another email. My publisher wrote to say the following: "Apologies for taking so long to review your novel. I've been reading it all week, and though I've only just finished part one, I wanted to tell you that I'm very taken by it. I will keep reading, but I am fairly confident that I will want to publish it. Either way, I didn't want to keep you in suspense." Fairly confident? Didn't want to keep me in suspense? What if he hates the rest of the book? This didn't promise me anything. After getting up from the metaphorical floor, I went back to waiting. Will he or won't he? Well, he did. All the faith that I had that one day the novel would be published finally became reality this past September. And I was absolutely delighted with the care and attention that Wicked Son gave to the novel. So you may ask, what drove me to write this ancient story? In fact, it was largely a passage from The Fruit of Her Hands. When French authorities burned 24 cartloads of volumes of Talmud, my heroine recited Psalm 137, relating the pain of exile. In her musings, she recalled, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and brought the writings of God and the writings of the people together into the Torah, and the great teachers contemplated them in a magnificent debate that has lasted until today." I was intrigued by the pain that the Judeans must have felt, separated from the land they loved. So, as always, when I start a novel, I began with research, which in this case included several books of the Bible. On a basic level, Babylon is the story about young Sarah, who is let off in chains with her people after Nebuchadnezzar's troops leveled the city of Jerusalem and burned the temple. Longing to return home, Sarah raised her children and grandchildren on a small barley farm near Babylon. It's also the story of the royal family, focusing on three siblings vying for power. And it's the story of Daniel the prophet. Daniel reconciles the dreams that the three bring to the mighty Nebuchadnezzar to convince him to name one of them his heir. This prophet speaks truth to power and teaches the exiles how to maintain their faith without temple sacrifice. Among the themes I explored in this novel is one that I've addressed in pretty much all of my books, that of the struggle between assimilation and maintaining our Jewish traditions. For the Judeans captive in Babylon, there were temptations galore. Some succumbed to the riches of the mighty empire, others to the faith of Marduk and the other gods. During biblical times, if your country were vanquished, it was common to think that their gods must be more powerful than your own. Several ancient peoples disappeared from the face of the earth because they surrendered themselves to another nation's gods and religious practices. For the Judeans, this was complicated because Nebuchadnezzar's troops had burned the temple to the ground. Hebrew practice, like those of other ancient peoples, revolved around temple sacrifice. With no ability to worship the temple, how could the Judeans keep their faith? One way was the prophet Daniel's way, through private prayer and new religious practices. I attempted in Babylon to show how, in the face of the temple's destruction, the Judeans maintained their faith, mainly through prayer and the agency of scribes who wrote down the stories that ended up in the Tanakh. In fact, in many ways, the religious practices that the exiles evolved are closer to our own religion than that of the Judeans before the exile. One of the dilemmas of assimilation was, as it is, in more contemporary times, that of intermarriage. Uri, a scribe, falls in love with Zakiti, a Babylonian woman. This was very much in the tradition of ancient peoples. If you remember, Moses married the Midianite Zipporah, Boaz married the Moabite Ruth, and so forth. But at the end of the novel, when the Judeans return to Jerusalem, they're commanded to banish their non-Jewish wives and children by the prophet Ezra. Uri must make a decision that tears at his heart. And yet, as I ask in my author's note, could this be one reason why we Jews have survived as a people when so many other ancient nations did not? I don't know the answer, but I certainly hope the astute reader will ask the question. Another aspect of the novel that fascinated me was the writing down of the oral tradition that bound our people as one. Reconciling the different stories of the creation, the story of Adam and Eve leaving the garden, the story of Noah, which was made controversial when Uri's wife claimed that it was simply a Babylonian tale that she told him. How could I, with these stories, not be captivated as a writer? But using the Bible as a source of research proved challenging. I didn't want to alienate either the reader of faith nor the more secular reader who approaches the Bible as myth. This was particularly problematic when it came to the various miracles told in the book of Daniel. In each case, I tried to keep the miraculous stories ambiguous. A man swathed in a black cloak may have been the hand that wrote on the wall, writing the Babylonian king that his destruction was imminent. The entire story of Daniel in the lion's den is told as a dream by a dying woman. I call this giving the reader plausible deniability. Ultimately, having spent so much time writing about the Babylonians, it bewilders me why this crucial period of Jewish history is not as well known as, let's say, the return from Egypt, the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, the Holocaust, or even the founding of the State of Israel. So often, the longevity of the Jewish people is marveled at. How in the world had we survived when other ancient peoples did not? Yet we rarely consider the fundamental shift in how we worshiped in Babylon, which has been instrumental in helping us maintain our faith during our 2,000 years of exile. In my eyes, it is just as much a seminal event for us as a people as any other, and should be recognized as such. For my reading selection, before October 7th, I probably would have shared the searing start of the novel, how Nebuchadnezzar's troops razed Jerusalem, burned the temple, and forced the exiles to Babylon. Since then, however, I find it too difficult a passage to read aloud, despite many readers who tell me that it helped them better understand our own traumatic tragedy. So instead, I'm going to read a portion about Uri the scribe and his Babylonian wife. While Uri's fellow scribe Ezra reveled in the law, Uri immersed himself in the accounts of the world's beginnings. In time, their master, Baruch ben Nuriah, knew which scribe to dispatch for which task. They want someone to relate the story of the apple to, Baruch said one morning. Ezra groaned, but Uri's eyes lit up. That means more about Adam and Eve, they who were placed in the Garden of Eden naked and knew no shame, Uri mewed. Praise the Most High that he taught us the difference between nakedness and clothes. Ezra shuddered. Imagine walking the streets of Babylon naked. It would be worse than how the Babylonians dress. Uri turned so Ezra would not notice the sudden flush coloring his face. Zakiti. For him, the Babylonian girl was the perfect Eve. Her transparent and loose clothing, her warm breath on his face, her sweet, pliant body offered without artifice or coyness. Uri could imagine how God created Eve from Adam's body, because Zakiti fit so perfectly to him. She was his missing part, that rib removed to form her. Ori wrote the story of the apple. Eve was tempted and ate, and shame grew upon her. The idea of the serpent made Ori uncomfortable. Evil, how did it manifest itself in the universe? Was it something from outside of Eve, or something within that made her disobey God? And what if God wanted her to disobey? After days of agitated reflection, Ori decided to break with Zakiti. She was Eve to him, and Eve was weak, tempted by the evil within the serpent. He waited for her at the Ishtar gate, but despite waiting until the sun set to the west, Zakiti never appeared. He was bewildered, almost hurt. Had she decided to end it herself? He stood looking up at the massive blue gate with its crenellated bastions, its glittering blue tiles adorned with white and ochre bulls and dragons. He'd been told that the gate's walls were thick enough to allow a 4-horse chariot to turn with ease high above the city. Before him towered the ziggurat, with its 8-step stories, a long straight staircase leading as if into the heavens, its smoke marking sacrifices to Marduk. Turning away, he entered the market district with its bustling stalls. Ori never entered the market without realizing anew that Babylon was the center of the world, that all roads led to its rivers, that conquered kings paid tribute to its might, and that the illustrious city contained every richness imaginable. The scent of spices and roasting meat pervaded the market's narrow alleyways, and the wind rustled vibrantly colored cloth from as far away as the lands of Asia. The clamor of tradesmen bartering with housewives echoed off the thick brick walls. The market was where he'd first met Zakiti, in a shop he frequented for scribal supplies. Zakiti, why did everything in this majestic city of Babylon remind him of her? Turning, he left the city, pondering what to do. She was just a woman. What gave her the right to end it? He arrived home to find his stepfather in the yard, sitting with a small, portly Babylonian, wearing a rich trader's garb of woven cloth, a heavy sash thrown over one shoulder. Is this he? The trader asked Reuven, who was pouring them both wine. This is Uri, my stepson, said Reuven, turning a baleful glare on him. The trader rose. I am Nutesh, father of Zakiti, who will bear your child when the winter rains begin. Uri felt the ground threaten to come up to meet him. Reuven, watching his stepson's face, must have seen the guilt written there. He picked up his cup of wine and threw it at him. Nutesh, who'd hastily drawn his stool back to avoid being splashed, now turned to Uri, his voice stern. You'll marry my girl? You won't leave her in shame? Uri closed his eyes. Adam and Eve learned to wear clothing when they discovered their nakedness. Zakiti had tempted him, and like Adam, he had fallen. He would cover her shame and his own with the garb of marriage. For a moment, Ezra's smug, sanctimonious face swam before him. What would Ezra say when he learned Uri had wed a Babylonian? Would he still be permitted to serve as scribe? But Adam had taken Eve's hand as they walked out of the garden. Uri could do nothing less. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. That was great. That was great. Okay. I am going to introduce our next author. Dina Kraft is co-author of the best-selling book, My Friend Anne Frank, a memoir she wrote with Hannah Pick Gossler. She is opinion editor at Haaretz English and co-host of Groundwork, a podcast about Israelis and Palestinians working for change. Previously, Dina was a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, the Christian Science Monitor, and JTA. I forgot UPI. Dina has reported from over a dozen countries and was the recipient of a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard and an Ockberg Fellowship at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Moment Magazine, among others. She was the winner of the 2020 B'nai B'rith World Center Jerusalem Award for Journalism, recognizing excellence in diaspora reportage. So let me spotlight you, Dina.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you. And thanks for that moving reading, Michelle. That was beautiful. Um, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the process of writing, a little bit different than the other writers. I'm actually what's called a ghostwriter or a co-writer, which is a very different process. And when I started helping Hannah Pitt Goslar, one of Anne Frank's best friends, 2 springs ago, write her book, I knew we were in a race against time. She was still razor sharp of mind, but she was quite frail of body at 93. And she'd get tired after a couple of hours of talking. And she'd say, let's take a break. And I'd say, that's fine. We can break for today. But then she would almost always find another thread, another story. And then I'd settle in and I'd keep recording. And the final weeks of her life, which ended October 28th, 2022, she was surrounded by her beloved, very big family in Jerusalem, and it felt like a split screen. While she was dying in Jerusalem, I was in Tel Aviv, immersed in her life as a child and her family and her friends who did not survive the Holocaust, and I was writing as quickly as I could. And remarkably, Hannah was not only speaking to me in her last year of life, she was also chatting with school children in a small French town in the Pyrenees by Zoom. These same school children, or their teacher rather, is taking them in her footsteps to Amsterdam in the spring, and also taking them to Bergen-Belsen. It's really quite an amazing trip. These are kids who are from all walks of life, immigrant children, many of them Muslim, many of them from African countries, and they have become to know Hannah's story. She was also speaking to a German documentary team about the torturous 10 days that she and almost 3,000 other Bergen-Belsen prisoners endured on what was called the Lost Train. All of them were starving and they were ill and feverish with typhus. And Hannah, at the end of the war, was 16 years old, and she weighed just 66 pounds. And she was so she slept through liberation by Russian soldiers. And mind you, the whole time that she was in those last days in Bergen-Belsen, she was always looking for someone. Who was she looking for? Anne Frank. Because by complete fluke, Anne Frank ended up being but first of all, Anne Frank, of course, was in hiding, which Hannah didn't know. I mean, Hannah knew that she disappeared one day. In June 1942, they had just both turned 13. Not long before that, Anna had just turned 13. She'd just been given her famous diary 2 weeks before on her birthday, and they'd all celebrated her birthday party together, her and her classmates. And she knocked on the door to play one morning, and Hannah wasn't there. And the cover story left by a hastily written note by Mr. Frank, her father, was that they'd escaped to Switzerland. Of course, anyone who knew anything about anything would have realized they could not have escaped to Switzerland. The borders were completely closed, but that was the cover story, and that's what Hannah and her friends believed. And this was the very first person that would go missing from her circle. Later on in the fall, the teachers would do roll call, and they wouldn't know if a student was missing because they were deported, or because they'd gone into hiding, or because they just had the flu. They just didn't know. And when I spoke with Hannah, she would often say, like, always the Shoah, always the Holocaust. I wish we could talk about something else. So does my dog. Hold on a second. Alfie, wait. Hold on a second. Lev, can you get Alfie? Thank you. Get my assistant to get my dog out of the picture. Sorry about that. And one of the things I've thought about a lot since October 7th was, first of all, being quite relieved that Hannah is not here to live this horrible moment in time. But also that she spoke a lot about how quickly life changed for her, how quickly things went from very, very warm and secluded, and very sort of cloistered. And it's, sorry. Real life intrudes. She talked a lot about how life changed very quickly. And of course, on October 7th, in Israel, and of course abroad as well, life changed from one minute to the next. So I thought I'd actually sort of dive in with a couple of moments that really speak to that change. And remember that Hannah, like Anna, and I call her Anna because that was her name. We know her as Anne Frank, but her friends and family called her Anna. She was Anna Frank. And there were 3 little girls that were best friends, Hannah, Anna, and Sanna. And Hannah's the only of the 3 to have survived. And they lived in a beautiful neighborhood. I hope you can one day visit it if you're ever in Amsterdam. It's South Amsterdam. It's a leafy, beautiful, sort of almost not quite a suburb of Amsterdam, but like a more family-friendly part of the city, where a lot of other German Jewish refugees, like Hannah and Anna's families, had come to find home. So I write, Hannah tells, Rivenbert was a warm bubble of friendship, school, and community. Nestled in the center of this cocoon was Mervetter Plain Square, a place of our own creation, where we counted down backwards in big boisterous voices for epic games of hide and seek, squealing in delight when someone was found. With other friends from the neighborhood, Anna and I rode scooters, played hopscotch, and pushed hoops with a stick. Round and round the hoops whirled. We'd run and giggle alongside them, trying to keep up. We were focused as only children can be in the moment. That hoop must keep spinning. We felt invincible. We felt free. We thought our cozy, contained, protected world would keep spinning onwards. We thought it would last forever. Okay, and now I'm going to skip to May 1940. I woke up in the pre-dawn darkness of my bedroom, confused by a low rumbling sound, growing louder, building to a roar. Is this thunder, I thought? It must be thunder. But I was frightened. At nearly 12 years old, I was perhaps getting a little old to run into my parents when I was scared in the night, particularly now when I was going to be a big sister. My mother was pregnant with a much longed for second child due in the autumn, but still I darted out of bed and raced to their room. I curled up close to my mother. Shh, shh, she said, pulling me close. The morning light was just beginning to seep in. My father pulled back the curtain to look outside. The noise was not thunder. It's planes, he said. I looked at my parents. They were people of action, yet in that moment they appeared paralyzed. This was almost as frightening to me as the noise of the planes. Eventually, one of them turned on the light and then the radio in the living room. There were messages from the government. Stay indoors. Close the curtains. Do not stand by the windows. I was still only half awake, but I could feel my heart pounding, full of fear. It was Friday, the 10th of May, 1940. The three of us, like people across the country, were waking up in shock. The German Luftwaffe was attacking Schiphol Airport, the main airport in the country, both a civilian and military airfield, 10 miles southwest of us. The roar was warplanes, swarming low in the sky, seeming to hover one above the other. They flew so low in some areas that people could see the swastikas on their wings. It was a massive show of force. No declaration of war had been received by the neutral Dutch government. The Germans simply started bombing, paratroopers following immediately after the aerial bombardment. They wanted to show us they were here. The dreaded invasion, dismissed as far-fetched by most Dutch, had come. Do I have to go to school? I asked my parents. No, I'm sure there's no school today, my mother replied, her voice flat. My father was afraid that as a former government official who had opposed the Nazi Party, he would be a specific target once the Germans arrived. He started sorting through the folders he had brought with him from Berlin, his eyes scanning through various pages and documents for articles he wrote critical of Hitler and the Nazis and any other potentially incriminating material. We have to get rid of these, he said to Mama. My mother joined him, and they began piling papers together in a stack and then ripping them in small pieces. There were soon so many pieces of ripped-up paper, my mother brought out several bowls to gather them. Hannalie, we need your help, she told me. It's going to be your job to flush these pieces of paper down the toilet. Not too many at a time, though, she warned. I nodded, baffled by my mission, but determined to help. I took out the ripped-up pages, some of them embossed with stamps and calligraphy, others crammed with typewritten words, and with a trembling hand, I dropped them into the toilet basin. I tried to focus on my job, but my mind raced. Could my father be arrested? Would he be punished severely? We knew of concentration camps for political prisoners, like Dachau. We did not know what happened there exactly, only that it was nothing good. Oh no, my mother groaned. Otto Braun! She was pointing to the large bust of Otto Braun, my father's former boss, and one of the most powerful men in the Weimar Republic. It was perched in the corner of our living room. It had come with us from Berlin 6 years ago. a physical reminder of another era, but it now appeared to my parents as incriminating evidence. My father, mindful of my mother's pregnancy, told her to stop trying to move it by herself. No, no, I'll do it, he said. I watched as he bent to his knees to lift it and started hauling it out of the apartment. If the Germans searched our home and found this, we'd definitely be in trouble, Papa told me, noticing how startled I looked. So bronze lightness, bald head, bushy eyebrows, round glasses, cast in bronze, was dragged down 2 flights of stairs by my father, my mother assisting, and I looking on with confusion, as a symbol of a revered figure in my father's life was unceremonially shoved onto the street. I wondered what the neighbors would think of this behavior. But when I looked around, I was stunned to see the pavements piled up with destroyed papers and discarded books. People were pouring out of their apartments and onto the streets with armfuls of whatever they thought might get them into trouble. Anything the Germans find might find suspect or forbidden, and all has to go, one man said as he dumped his trove into a bin. The sun was rising into a brilliant sky, blue sky. It was an especially beautiful spring day after another seemingly endless wet, windswept winter, and completely out of place as a backdrop to the rising sense of shock and fear people felt all over the Low Countries, now under German bombardment, but especially by my parents and other German Jewish refugees who understood what the Nazis might be capable of. We were glued to the radio. It became clear the Dutch military, outgunned, outmanned, was having an impossible time staving off the overwhelming force of the German assault. Black smoke curled from the sky from oil supplies in the port of Amsterdam being destroyed by Dutch authorities before the Germans could capture them. We could all smell the smoke in South Amsterdam. By the next day, we were plastering blackout paper on the windows as the punishing air raids continued on Rotterdam, which had by now injured hundreds. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, we were devastated to hear that Queen Wilhelmina and her daughter, Princess Juliana, and her husband, Prince Bernhard, with their 2 young daughters, Beatrix and Irene, had sailed to Britain. The security establishment determined they could no longer guarantee their safety, so they had fled. Fled! It felt like a betrayal. I thought of the trading cards of the royal family that Anna and I had collected. They felt like people we knew, people we trusted. Within hours, it emerged that the Dutch government, the prime minister and his cabinet, had also escaped to Britain by boat. Like everyone in Holland, we were overcome to hear they left us all alone in the clutches of the Germans. So from then, the story is written very much from Hannah's point of view. She's 12 years old at this point. By the time she's 14, she is deported with her father. Her mother has since died in childbirth, her grandparents and a little sister, first to Westerbork, which was a transit camp on the border of Germany and Holland, and then into Bergen-Belsen, where she not only survives, but she keeps her sister alive. And she has this incredible moment where across the fence, she hears that there's this new group of women that have come in. They're wearing black and white striped uniforms. They're very thin. They're very gaunt. Some of them are sick. And the Germans forbid the women from talking to each other on the other opposite sides of the fence, but women being women find a way to talk to each other. And word comes to Anna through through a neighbor from Amsterdam that Anne Frank is across the fence. And of course, Hannah is horrified by this news. She's thought this whole time that Anna was the one person she could count on who was safe in Switzerland with her grandmother, drinking hot chocolate, skiing and ice skating. She had this whole idea in her head. Until this day, she still was sort of shocked that Anna wasn't in safety in Switzerland with her grandmother. And they have this incredible reunion, which you can read about in the book, or I can tell you a bit more about in the Q&A. And she finds Anna as a sort of shrunken shadow of her former self. Her beautiful, beloved hair that they used to spend hours putting in curlers together was shorn. She was starving. She was hungry. She was starving from hunger. And her sister Margot was very, very sick. It was one of the things that was interesting with Hannah was as writing this book with her was she had told her story so many times, it had become kind of rote for her. And my challenge as her co-author was to sort of try to find how to, even after all these years, find new memories and find new ways and try to bring emotion into the story as well. And I was very much assisted in that regard in reading other diaries from the time, contemporary diaries, people who were in the same places at the same time that Hannah was. I think I'll just end on this note. We think about Anne's diary, and it's called Diary of a Young Girl. And we think of like, wow, she was just, kind of just poured out of her in this amazing writing. Yes, it did pour out of her in a certain amount, in a certain way. And it was this very, focused view of her internal life. But at one point, they were listening in the attic to the radio, and the Dutch Minister of Communication came on the air, and he said, Dutch women, Dutch men, Dutch children, people are not going to believe what we've lived through in this war. Please keep your diaries. Please keep your letters, because one day we need to document what happened here to real people. Everybody in the attic, with their heads whip around, they look at Anna, because they all know she's keeping this diary, and they say, Anna, your diary. And from that age on, this is the final months that she's in the attic, like the last, I think, 9 months she's in the attic. She starts revising her diary. She really becomes a writer. This is not the unbosomings of a young girl. This is a young woman, a young writer finding her voice. And she starts adding, like a journalist might, like background about the anti-Jewish laws. And one of the people she speaks about, of course, is Hannah, who if you remember the diary, she knows her as Lise. That was her nickname, Hannah Lise. And there's a segment in the diary where she talks about poor Hannah and sort of waking up from a waking dream and the horror of what Hannah must be enduring while she is safe in the annex and Hannah is out in the cruel world. And of course, in the end, it's Hannah who is the lucky one and who really is a living, breathing testament to their friendship to her dying day, by keeping the story of Anna alive. And in some ways, I was quite honored to be that someone called the book a sequel to the diary, because it sort of reveals sort of what Anna what it didn't live in to tell us about Auschwitz, about Bergen-Belsen, and also a window into life after the war and about rebuilding and reclaiming. And you talked about being resilient, and that was very much what Hannah was. With that, I will pass on the baton.
Thanks so much, Dina. That was beautiful, and it's interesting what you said about who was it that told them to keep the diary, because nowadays, like right away after October 7th, there are all these efforts to make sure that we're keeping track of the Jewish Book Council and the National Library of Israel and all these other places that are asking for, contributions from writers, from just everybody, to document what we've been going through. Okay, now I will introduce our third author. Courtney Sender's essays have appeared in the New York Times Modern Love, The Atlantic, and Slate, and her short stories have appeared in Plowshares, Agni, The Kenyon Review, American Short Fiction, Tin House, and many others. Her debut book, In Other Lifetimes, All I've Lost Comes Back to Me, was called A Stunner from the Very First Page by Disha Filia, Miraculous by Ann Patchett, and Literary Rock and Roll by Amy Bender. A Yaddo and McDowell Fellow, Courtney holds an MFA from the Johns Hopkins Writing Seminars and an MTS from Harvard Divinity School. She is currently at work on a debut novel, and she is coming to us from, hold on, from Connecticut, right? Yes. Wait, I gotta, for the Connecticut people on the line, where in Connecticut?
New London. I teach at Connecticut College. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Dina and Michelle for really beautiful readings. I'm really looking forward to reading both of those books. And thank you to Julie for running this, especially at this time. So I'm going to talk about my debut book, which is In Other Lifetimes, All I've Lost Comes Back to Me. It's a linked story collection that covers, I think, quite a lot of ground. But what it's really trying to capture for me is my dual interests as a writer and as a person are basically in love, longing, loneliness, the condition of contemporary women in those states, especially in kind of urban settings, urban landscapes, coupled with something that seems much perhaps bigger or at a much more historical scale, which is the legacy of the Holocaust, which is the experience of my own family, my own life. My grandparents on my father's side are both Holocaust survivors. I was very close with my grandmother, who passed a few years ago, but she's from Czechoslovakia. Her entire family died in the war. And I'm constantly thinking as a writer about how do I put these two really disparate kinds of interests on top of each other. There's a problem of scale when you're trying to write about dating and love and longing as a contemporary woman against the magnitude of death and Jewish death that happened in the Holocaust. Yet I'm really interested in this as a project because it feels like that to me is the legacy for the third generation inheritance of living as people, daily life as people in the modern world with these kinds of ghosts over our shoulders. So what I thought I would do with my time with you guys is kind of go back and forth between reading some excerpts of the book and then talking about the way that I'm trying to approach this problem in a way that is, I think, respectful, I hope respectful of both the experience of love and longing, which I take to be serious problems, especially in a post-Holocaust kind of Jewish world, a Jewish diaspora, in the case of those of us in the United States, where reproduction matters for the Jewish people, which is, of course, closely linked to love and longing. And how do we put that against something with the magnitude of the Holocaust without minimizing either? So I wanted to read just a little bit from the first story, which is going to touch very little on the Holocaust, but very much on the love and longing section. And then I hope that by doing this, it'll show you the way that I'm working in this book. I hope to ease in to the questions of how do you bring the Holocaust into this? So the first story here is going to be a little bit magical realist, and you'll see I'll end at a point where I think it hopefully it helps you see the way that I'm trying to ease in readers to this question of what kind of legacy is leading us to today's world. So hold off for the Jewishness. It'll come in, I promise. So the first story here, it's the title story. So it's called "In Other Lifetimes, All I've Lost Comes Back to Me." And I'm going to read, I'll cut myself off. In other lifetimes, all I've lost comes back to me. Yes, all of them. Be the drunk and C the poet and D the coward. And smaller stories too, minor loves. Y the Capricorn and X the sock salesman and W the scholar and V the painter. They all come back and I am the biggest regret of their lives. I was the love of their life that they let get away. Anywhere from 38 to 18 years ago. In the meantime, they had families. They had wives, they had children, they had furniture they bought and dogs they raised and soccer teams they coached. In the meantime, I waited. I sat here in my wooden house in my wooden chair and I looked out my wood-framed window at the wooden swing hanging from the tree in my front yard and I thought, please, one of you, any one of you, change your mind and turn around and please come back to me. My loves, I will give anything. Anything I used to think. I'd been willing to become the woman I would have been with any of the seven. Different women all, and all different from who I became, which is a woman unformed, staring out a window, watching my swing rot year by year. With B, I'd have become playful, with C, quiet, with D, unstoppered, with Y, edgy, X, poor, W, snobbish, with V, addicted. Each of them had their perks and their downfalls. With D and W, I'd have lived in a house we owned in the suburbs with a finished basement and 2 cars we drove and one that just sat in the driveway. With X and C and V, I'd have lived in a city apartment complex that was half public housing. With B and Y, I'd have traveled, I'd have rented, I'd have been always going somewhere new. For 20 years, I was ready. I would have lived any of those lives. In all worlds, I'd have stayed Jewish and a daughter and a granddaughter. That's it. Those were the only constants I required to remain identifiably myself. So that's just the first page and a half of the first story in here. And what I was thinking here is I'm going to introduce with this book, which goes on to kind of deepen into these themes, and I'll read a little bit more from, I think, parts that deepen more. I wanted to pull in readers who maybe are Jewish, maybe are not Jewish, who are kind of open to this question of love and longing and this idea of what we could have been in these other worlds. But then I wanted to start with easing in with what would be constant. What would be constant in a world in which the people we meet in this life are going to change who we become, who we are, who we want to become, but what would remain singular and constant? And for me and for my character who sets up the story or sets up the book with this story, it's being Jewish, a daughter, and a granddaughter, which to me are three very linked things in my experience. And again, because I think Judaism is so linked not only matrilineally, but with the notion of ancients and those who've come before us and what we're taking on from those who come before us. So this first story is a way in, I think, in a somewhat magical way, to this question of what feels constant. And the constancy is this Jewishness and this granddaughterliness. The reason why I start the book this way is that I then continue to develop these themes. This is a linked short story collection, which is a kind of interesting form. I think the form of a linked short story collection is itself a little bit of a paradox. What a short story is meant to do is conclude and stand alone. To link the short stories is to allow something that stands alone to also be a part of something larger and to speak to something that hopefully is the sum, greater than the sum of its parts. So that's the first story in the collection. As I moved through, I wanted to really deepen into this theme, having introduced and hopefully brought readers in a somewhat lighter way to this question of Jewishness, legacy, etc. I then wanted to bring readers in more deeply in a later story. So I don't think that I could have really earned a story that looks more head-on about the relationship between sex, loneliness, longing as a contemporary woman, and the Holocaust until I kind of eased us in. And then later in the book, I sort of revisit these kinds of themes in a much more, I think, direct way with respect to Holocaust themes and looking at the past. So I wanted to read just a little bit and think about the evolution that I hope I've kind of achieved here. From the first story, which eases us in a magical way, to the story that happens midway through the book, where we're thinking again about love, longing, the relationship with Jewishness and the ancestors, but I hope you'll see pretty quickly that this is a very different kind of approach. And yeah, so I'll read just a little bit from this story in the middle of the book. So the story in the middle of the book is called I Am Going to Lose Everything I Have Ever Loved. We begin with facts. You loved me first. Before you knew it, you have come to say, from the instant you saw me. This story of yours, of course, is a fairy tale. You only smiled at a girl who could have been any girl on a bridge, river flowing under her, traffic rushing behind her, brown curly hair, and an hourglass her dress wasn't trying to hide. Of course, I believe you loved me from the instant you saw me and centuries before. Time bends, Samuel, in a story that is true. All our love was packed into that first smile. No. No, you are going to leave me, and when you do, you aren't coming back. I am susceptible to letting myself get carried away. Hope can carry me a long way, to another story where my fury makes you choose me. This is my problem, my friend says over coffee now, that I'm incapable of anger in the presence of its object. She sets her mug on the windowsill with a light clink. The barista loves her. I'm drinking from a paper cup that says Dina without a capital, and he's already bringing her a fresh pot of cream. Nonetheless, she's right. I can sit in a coffee shop reporting my anger, but before you, I can only laugh or beg or hope. Hope, that murderer. The unmet longing that my heart bangs its head against. Hope is the bubbles in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, and truth is the fan waiting to chop my head off. Kill it. Hope for nothing and live. My friend should not fetishize hope. It wasn't hope that kept her going in the camps, my Nana Ita always said. Why then did you live, I would ask her, trying not to sob, because even as a teenager, all I felt when I was with her was the hope that the next time I saw her, I would bring a man who would raise children with me, so she would know I was going to keep our family alive even after they had killed us. Why then did she live? It's life, she would say, the because somewhere built in. I know she felt we were surrounded by ghosts, she and I, as we sat in her living room, my unmade cousins right there with us tapping on the glass. I felt them sometimes too. The night Samuel and I first slept together in the B&B behind the bridge, I never told him this, I felt my Nana's ghosts lying in bed beside us. then flattening themselves to hover in the ever smaller space between us, then pressing their pinky fingertips inside along with his, which was a good feeling. It was what made me so willing to bring him inside without asking questions. They were staking their claim, coming to. When he was with me, I thought of Nana. I thought, thank God, I suppose that was when I loved him. So this story goes on to really, I hope in explicit ways, link contemporary love, longing, sex, etc., with this pressure of the Holocaust, the ghosts of the Holocaust, the need to honor the Holocaust, and this cosmology, which I talk quite a lot about as the story goes on, of these unmade cousins. So my way that I was able to kind of understand or concretize rather the legacy of the Holocaust in the modern age for these stories is this: I have this notion of not only ghosts of the Holocaust in terms of those who were killed, which I think, the documentary evidence, like as in Dina's work really, that Dina's work really beautifully shows, I think the documentary evidence has done wonderful work and continues to do wonderful work for those who were actually lost. I'm interested in fiction and conceptualizing the idea of souls who never got to be made. They were set to be made, set to enter this world, but then the parents who were supposed to make them were shot or killed or put into a pit. And so what happens with this essentially longing for life that never got to be created? And so I sort of conceptualize the ghosts of the Holocaust not only as those who died, which again, I think the documentary evidence can support, but all those who never got to be made because of it. If we think of the 6 million had they lived, how many more millions of people would have been made? So I think very much as a third generation Holocaust survivor writing about other people in that condition, I'm thinking about the ghosts of their cousins, who would have been their cousins, all of these people who would have been made. And to what degree do those of us who have been made, and as I say, I and my character are direct descendants of those who survived the camps, those who have been made, what kind of obligation do we have to help bring those unmade, that life longing out into the world? So that sort of becomes the arc of the book. So I think I hopefully in fiction pull us in with a kind of very surreal, magical fiction story, introduce the notion of the Jewish aspect of love and longing, and then kind of pull us in more deeply as the book goes along. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Q&A is this is a heavily nonfiction based book. And in the end, I wanted to include a photo of my grandmother and her family who survived. So at the end of the book, this is for the real Ita, I call it, Nana Ita. My grandmother is this one over here, this defiant looking girl. Her brother Herman lived, everyone else was killed in the camps. I wanted to say for the real Ita, it's a bit of a trick. Nana Ita is the character in these stories. My grandmother's name was Esther. She was known as Ita because her older sister gave her her papers in order to escape. And so the United States officially knew her as Ita. So, but she was Esther. And so for the real Ita, I dedicate this book both to my grandmother, who was technically Ita, who created me, and to her sister and all those who died, who are the unmade and what they would have created. So that's kind of where the book, where the book concludes. And yeah, hopefully that gives you a kind of sense of the kind of work I'm trying to do with connecting contemporary love, longing, reproduction with the legacy of the Holocaust. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm gonna spotlight as you guys are putting your questions in. And I'll just say my grandmother's name was also Ita. Well, we knew her as Etta. My mom is on the call now, her daughter. She was not in the Holocaust. I think she was already in the States by then. And let me just add all of our writers to the spotlight, and Michelle, add you. And I'll ask, wait, I'm going to ask you all to unmute. I saw a few questions, and I have a bunch of questions for all of you. So let's see. First of all, Joanna said that she loved your book, Dina. It was very interesting to hear your process. Erica has a question for Courtney. You've published so many stories, including several Jewish stories that aren't in this book. Any chance that there's another collection in the works? Anything else you can tell us about what may be coming next?
Thank you, Erica. Thank you so much for this question and for being here. Yeah, so there are many stories that I've published that aren't in this book. There's actually notably in the middle of this book, right before the story that I just excerpted, there's one story that goes into a historical concentration camp. Only one, and my editor and I talked a lot about this, about how much should we be in the history, how much should we be dealing with the present. I was really insistent that we needed one story that goes into the history. The story that we chose is, I called it The Docent. It's about a former museum docent who's in the camps who shows Edward Murrow around the camps. In reality, Edward Murrow was given a tour of the concentration camp, but we don't have information about the person who toured him around. So I kind of inserted fiction there. That's where I feel ethically capable of putting fiction into the evidence. So the one story we have that's in the camp, that's where it comes from. However, there's a story that I've published in the Colorado Review called Prayer for Being Kissed, which is, I think, my best story that's set in the camps. It's set in a killing pit in Poland with one person who survived and comes out with holes in their hands and naked and bedraggled and gets mistaken for Jesus Christ. And so this is based on a Yiddish folk tale that I kind of adapted to the Holocaust. And that's my favorite. That's my best Holocaust story, I think. And I wasn't able to put it in this book because my editor said it was too dark. So Erica, to your point, I am hopeful that from this, I'll be able to launch up and kind of have a little bit more say in what I get to say and what I get to write. So yes, I do hope another collection is in the works. Right now, I'm working on a novel that deals with these themes, trains in the modern day and trains in the Holocaust. So kind of thinking again about the doubling. But yes, I'm hopeful that another collection can include some of those other stories. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question for Dina. When you were talking about, as you were interviewing Hannah, you were trying to get her to bringing emotion into her story because she had told it so many times. So how did you go about doing that? And did you find like, and in many, I guess in my own family history, we heard of, my great aunt who had to, send her son off with like showing zero emotion on her face. So there's and in another book I read a few years ago, I think House on Endless Waters talks about it. The mother is a mother of ice and has no emotion. And so it seems to be a theme of people who went through the Holocaust. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that a little bit with Hannah.
I mean, I think for Hannah, the emotional side of it, or the sort of lack of emotion, and sometimes, or lack of like, she was a very warm person, but it was hard for her to like tap into her emotions. I think partially because I was asking her to do things that are sort of very 21st century, to put names to emotions and to things. And that she grew up in a very Yekka, a very German Jewish household where you didn't really necessarily talk about your emotions so much. Obviously, next door was living her best friend, Anna, who had great resources of emotions and could tap them very easily. So it wasn't just about being a German Jew. It's also personality. Her daughter would sit in on our interviews, and every time I would try to press her to give more emotion, her daughter would like howl with laughter, like, you're not going to get it, and indeed, I would say, like, she would describe like the saddest moment of her, one of the saddest moments of her life was the night in Westerbork, the transit camp, where she worked at the orphanage. And the orphanage was one day emptied out, basically, and all of the children she had to walk the children that she cared for to the train that would devour them like a snake, like an animal, every Tuesday morning. And Monday nights they would get these long lists, and until this point the orphans have been spared. And she's describing this to me, and I said, "Okay, you're back in the orphanage barracks. It's just you. What are you feeling?" She's like, "Bad." I felt badly. So she would say, like, "I give you license to sort of imagine." So that I had to sort of inhabit Hannah. I kind of had her blessing and permission to kind of inhabit her and inhabit her story and inhabit some of the emotion that she couldn't give voice to. And then when she'd read the passages, she approved of them, but it was like, so sometimes it was pulling out a bit more, where I could, but also a bit of an act of sort of imagination and those moments based on the reality of what she told me. And it's interesting, as a journalist, I covered a lot of trauma and a lot of crime and a lot of terror and a lot of, covered 2 intifadas. And I did as you mentioned, I did a fellowship at the Columbia School of Journalism in trauma. And one of the things they taught us was when you're interviewing somebody, their trauma is not your trauma. You have to be a first responder. You have to imagine that you're like wearing a yellow, bright, slickier rain jacket and the words fall on you like rain, but they don't penetrate your skin. And that's a fine theory and it can work, right? But I think in the case of helping Hannah tell her story, I couldn't have that separation. I was having nightmares, I was having very bad dreams when I was interviewing her. And we would regroup the next morning over tea and she would say, I had nightmares last night. And I would say, so did I. And I imagine them, apropos bachelor realism, like crisscrossing in the night, and then flash forward to October 7th, I was speaking to a therapist just in the first weeks after October 7th. And he said, well, everyone's having a hard time, but of course you're having maybe a different kind of a hard time because you just wrote a book about the Shoah and now you're editing and writing pieces, things that, were not the Shoah. I mean, I want to be clear, October 7th was not the Holocaust, but there are moments in it that echo it, right? And so, I don't think anybody in our generation thought that we would be a witness, Courtney's talking about these atrocities, that we would witness atrocities too. We would also be bearing witness, even if not personally, like to others. And you're talking about these massive documentation projects going on, which is something I find fascinating. We talk about, always like bearing witness as the last survivors of the Holocaust. And now, and their stories being urgent because of that. But now we also have these other stories to witness. And it's another time of thinking about bearing witness. Yeah.
That again brings me back to this interview I read today with Professor Danny Brum, one of Israel's foremost experts in trauma.
Yes.
I'm going to put the link in the chat here for anyone who's interested. And there's a whole, it's in Daniel Gordis's newsletter. You have to scroll to the bottom to get to the interview, but he talks about one unit of Miluimnikim, of reservists, who after they came out of Gaza, first of all, the army is doing a lot, or having all these kind of group sessions with them and trying to help them process for like 2 to 3 days.
Yeah.
And one unit asked to go meet with survivors, Holocaust survivors. He said,
Wow.
and that it was very helpful for them. And also, I can't remember the whole thing, but I'll put the thing in the chat. It was really interesting.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Let me scroll back up. There was a few questions. Looking for Jan's question. 1 second. Okay. For Courtney, have you ever heard of Nikos Kazantzakis, Saviors of God? Your story reminds me of that, only with a much needed female perspective.
Oh, thank you. I have not, but I will read it. And yes, I mean, I'm very interested in giving female perspectives to a lot of these stories. So the journalism story that I just said, the Edward Murrow story, it was a man who showed him around the camp, but I kind of invented a woman. The Yiddish folktale that I mentioned about a Jew being mistaken for Jesus, of course, that was about men, but it's a man in the camp, but it's a woman around them. So I'm really interested in bringing in the female perspective again, because I'm interested in Judaism and matrilineal lines of reproduction. And so I think that kind of is an angle that needs to be talked about. And of course, and I'm sure Dina, you could talk about this more, but abortions and things were elements of what happened in the camp, and they're not often spoken about. So I think that the female anatomical and reproductive perspectives are really important. Yeah, thank you for that suggestion.
And I see Tessie, who was not really a question, but I'll read your comment to everyone, Tessie, for those who didn't see. Courtney, just to mention, I'm in a poetry group, Voices Jerusalem. Your themes resonate with me as a survivor. In all modesty, and not to compare with your writings, one of the poems I shared is called My Grandmother Oma's Jeans. I've adapted her name to Safta, which is grandmother in Hebrew. Omi, now to my blessed 4th generation. That's what I'm called. And in it, my grandsons in the army ask whether their bravery is inherited from the earlier generations. Sorry, such a long sharing, which actually relates to all the presenters in a way. Thank you. And then another person wrote in the chat, I don't have the person's name. I'm a Colorado-based writer, journalist, creative nonfiction, and my bubby lost her brothers in the Holocaust. Can't wait to read your essays and curious about your research process. Also identify with the themes you're discussing, and since I am 51 and did not succeed in having children during that time that was an option, I'm also processing that loss from the perspective of generational trauma. Is there any reading you can recommend on third generation survivors who are processing this particular loss? Great question.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I don't know of reading specifically about that. I'll think about it and kind of share with Julie if I come up with something. I hope that there's work beyond my book that does. I wonder if anyone else knows that. But yeah, I think it's a beautiful question, and I think it'd be great to have some resources there.
Okay. Diana is asking, I guess this question for Dina. I'm fascinated that any journalism program has input about interviewing people with trauma. Is there more you can share with how to?
Sure. So first of all, it's called the DART Center for Journalism, Trauma, and Violence, it's at Columbia University School of Journalism. So yeah, for me, I had spent so many years not having any trauma-informed guidance on interviewing people. So it was hugely helpful to finally get some and then pass it on to my students when I was teaching journalism in Boston. So in addition to this idea that when you're interviewing somebody, their trauma is not your trauma because you were a first responder and you can't fully tell their story if you're a complete mess, right? And if you're complete, and it's also not really fair to them because their trauma is not your trauma, you know? So especially in an emergency situation, like unfortunately I've covered like suicide bombings in the past, and when I had students who would cover the Boston Marathon bombing, in that moment of an attack, you really have to sort of keep your bearings around you. So this is more about covering in the moment, but to like look for certain colors, like look for red traffic lights or look for anything red, but in the middle of an interview also like something that can center you in some way, look for something that can kind of calm you. And then in the interview, really, really important. I think sometimes, especially watching like TV journalism, people kind of go for the jugular very quickly. So what happened? You were raped. How? When? What? This fire happened. Like what? And you leave people like in the middle of that trauma. You re-trigger the trauma. So the way to do it in a more trauma-informed way is, first of all, you start, the interview. We say we're in a safe place. We're sitting at your kitchen table right now. What did you have for breakfast? Or what did you maybe have for breakfast that day of the incident, the day of the, God forbid, terrible moment or the terror attack or the moment of the war erupted in your town, like bring them back to sort of the more concrete, more mundane details of that day, build up to the moment of the violence, the crime, the incident. Maybe it was an ongoing incident. And then by the time you finish the interview, make sure that you're back in the safe present. Hi, we're sitting at your kitchen table. We're having a cup of tea. And you bring them back to the present and you remind them that they're safe and you remind them that they're in control. So those are some of the important tips I got. And I would say just in terms of the moment of now, it's, what's very different is experiencing a collective trauma. I think what's happening now, especially, in Israel, but you're hearing also in the States, of course, is these stories are coming out like drip drop, right? And so it's constantly the person who's also can get secondary trauma. In journalism, we talk about secondary trauma, not just in journalism, but social work and police work. In those first few days of October 7th, I was opening up my computer at work. As an editor of the op-ed page, I have to also select photographs that go with the pieces. And there are no trigger warnings on the photos from AP and Reuters until you actually open the photograph up. So you'll see, these really difficult images, but it's sort of too late, they'll say like, sensitive image, but you've already opened the image. You've already seen something you would wish you hadn't seen. And of course, this is also a story that's been played out in video because the Hamas terrorists had GoPros and they were filming everything and making and uploading it to social media directly. So everybody is at risk of secondary trauma, in our day and age. So we have to protect ourselves as much as we can,
That's
from
a
that.
really good point. Yeah. It's definitely something we in Israel have been talking a lot about, and in those first days we were worried about our kids seeing videos, right? But it's not just the kids, it's us too.
Yeah, and I have to say, in the mainstream Israeli media, you watch, the channels, you'll see the Hamas terrorists are coming, walking into the kibbutzim and with their guns, and that is terrifying enough, you know?
Yeah.
And there's no warning. They just roll with it.
Yeah. So I have a question for all three of you, but I'll start with Michelle, which is, how has either your writing or your talking about the book been affected by October 7th? And Michelle, I remember that you were about to have a book launch.
Yes.
Right. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, why you what you decided and how you decided it, and then we'll move on.
Right. No, so my book came out in the middle of September, and we were right in the middle of the high holidays. So I knew that I wasn't going to get any traction during that period. So I waited until October to start celebrating. And so my launch party happened after October the 7th. And I found it very difficult to decide whether to go on with it or not. And in fact, I finally did decide to do it. And I think Julie, you said we need to have literary events and celebrations. I think that was really useful for me, even though there were moments where it was very difficult to go ahead and do that. I also want to say the last time I was in Modiin, which was last year, I was basically researching a book about the real story of the Maccabees. And I went to the marvelous museum that you have in Modiin about that. And I was basing a lot of it on the protests that were happening at that point in time in Israel. And then, with the war, and especially as we got close to Hanukkah, I realized I couldn't write that book. I could not write that book. We needed heroes much more than we needed me to tell the true story of the Maccabees. So I've had to switch gears in that regard. I mean, and maybe someday I will get back to it. But yeah, a lot of things have been problematic in terms of promoting during this period. A number of places either postponed or canceled events. And I think, especially with, everything that we're learning right now about various events, it is definitely becoming, more and more of a problem to get out there and to say, oh, wow, look, here's my new book. It just happens to sort of have echoes of what's happening right now. But it is definitely an issue.
So I'll revise my question a little bit for Dina, which is, what do you think that Hannah or Anna would say to us in this moment?
Good question. Well, I think Hannah would maybe lean on sort of like something she always said in all of her speeches and her tours. And it was interesting. She was probably one of the survivors who has been telling her stories for the longest because of the cachet of Anna Frank, and because Otto Frank tapped her in like 1957 after the diary became a Broadway hit also and became a film. She went to America. There was not even a word for the Holocaust yet. And she went to 18 cities and told her story. And a sentence she sort of, I think, even used in those speeches and then continued to use until to the very end was, we're all created in the image of God. And then I think we've forgotten that. And a lot of her story was about, this is, the cautionary tale of the Holocaust is what happens when hatred is unchecked. And hatred is unchecked in part because people stop seeing each other as people. And we see that here. We see, obviously the people who committed October 7th didn't see the Jews of southern Israel as people. And we know a lot of, unfortunately, Israelis don't look at Palestinians necessarily as people, and as full human beings. And so I think that's what she would try to remind us of, and how we can find how we can heal, and how we can find our center, and how we can kind of get out of this endless sort of spiral of war and bloodshed and living on the sword, is to remember, our shared humanity, as corny and trite as that can sound. It's really profound. It's hard to speak for all people and Frank, but I think she she would want us to be documenting actually, and to be telling, and to be processing, and to be trying to make sense of something so dark, which is what she was trying to do. And I think, something that Hannah talked about was the sort of the frustration that Anna's story had been kind of trivialized and kind of put in this like quaint little box, like we're all basically good, because if you read Anne Frank's diary, there's a lot of other stuff in it that's about the coming thunder and the approach of the thunder and the approach of, of the horrors, and her knowing very much what was going on outside. So I think she would also tell us to keep our eyes open as well.
Courtney, what about you? How has it affected your writing or anything to do with your book?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think of how to phrase this in ways that isn't too depressing, frankly. But
Okay, we're all depressed.
Yeah, well, yes. Just thinking about, the way in which what is the efficacy of telling these stories essentially? And we have this never again, which has become the call of the Holocaust essentially in the aftermath, never again. And I think that the Jewish people have written and done and created plays and art and movies and everything that we can about what this was historically, and not just the Jewish people. There's other historians as well. And actually my advisor in divinity school was a Holocaust scholar who had been a Catholic scholar and sort of became a Holocaust scholar when he realized what Pope Pius had or had not done during the Holocaust. So, but still, I think that there's been a lot of writing and the arts about the Holocaust, and trying to think about there's balance the uniqueness of that event against the need to find parallels and draw parallels to today's world. And there's never going to be an exact parallel, but where can we draw parallels for the Jewish community, and as for protecting the Jewish community, as well as for generalizing more broadly about genocide, etc. And I think Dara Horn has written about that question a bit. And for me, it's a question of what am I trying to do here? Am I just trying to make art? Am I trying to offer a way to see some parallels? I don't necessarily think that fiction is the place to do that, but to force people to see parallels. But I would I think, to draw it into the modern world as I continue to do, and hope that people are willing to see that, I think civility, my book talks about this, is a little bit of a scrim sometimes, and it can cover up something really dark underneath, which I think the Holocaust should have proven to us to be true. And I hope that my writing, again, in the aftermath of October 7th and the fallout there, might help us see that, yes, there's this darkness around us clearly, and can we kind of hold on to Jewish community anyway, both in the present and today. I don't know. I don't have a great answer. I'm still working through how to read it. Yeah.
Okay. Before we end, I want to announce a couple things. Let me just share my screen for a second. Can you see my screen? Okay. Our next Literary Modiin event is going to be on Sunday, March 10th. With Nora Gold, Jay Michelson, and Avi Shalev. Nora is here with us tonight. And Nora will be talking about her 2 novellas, In Sickness and in Health and Yom Kippur in a Gym, and her anthology, 18 Jewish Stories Translated from 18 Languages. Avi will be talking about The Only Jew in the Room. He enrolled in a Islamic Sufi college in I forget where. And he talks about his experiences there. And Jay Michelson has a new story collection called The Secret That Is Not a Secret. So that is on March 10th. Later, a few days later, you may have heard me talking about this writer's mission, and I'll zoom in over here so you can see. It's meant to be kind of part solidarity mission, part writers conference. We are still trying to get the minimum number of people so that this can happen. So if you are interested in this mission in any way, please let me know as soon as possible. It's coming up very soon, March 13th to 17th. It includes visits to the southern communities and meetings with members of hostage families, and volunteering, which is one way some of us here have been kind of holding on to hope. Visits to Israeli literary sites like the gorgeous new National Library of Israel, as well as daily generative writing sessions with Israeli writers, but not on Shabbat. Shabbat in Jerusalem, and opportunity to meet lots of Israeli writers. So if you're interested in that, please let me know as soon as possible. And the last thing I want to close with is Mishuberach Lashvuim, a prayer for the captives. And you can read along with me. You can read the English, and I forget even where I found this version from. There's many different versions. This is not the one that we have in the Siddur that I use in my shul, but Mishberach Avotenu Beimotenu Abraham v'Sara Yitzchak v'Rivka Yaakov Leah v'Rachel v'et Lochamenu Yoshua David v'Yehuda Dvorah Yael v'Yehudit hu yivarech et shvuyei v'nederei tzahal v'ha'ezrachim v'ezrachiyot ha'chatufim v'chatufot הנתונים ונתונות בשבעה ובצרה. יהי רצון מלפניך אדוני צבאות שתפדה נפשם משבי ותחזירם במהרה לארצם ממשפחתם ולביתם. בריאים ושלמים בגופם ובנפשם ותיתן תבונה בלב העמלים בשחרורם ותיתן רחמים בלב שוביהם ויקוים בהם הכתוב כל ברמה נשמע נהי וכי תמורים רחל מבכה על בניה מענה להנחם על בניה כי איננו כה אמר אדוני מנעי קולך מבכי בעינייך מדמעה כי יש שכר לפעולתך נאום אדוני ושבו מארץ אויב ויש תקווה לאחריתך נאום אדוני ושבו בנים בנות לגבולם ונאמר amen. And that is from the book of Jeremiah, the original book of Jeremiah. That's it for tonight, everyone. Thank you very much to Courtney, Dina, and Michelle. Thank you to everyone who is here, and see you next time. Besorot tovot. May we hear good news. Amen.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.